All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Angela Ho, and it's a pleasure to present my work at EXPO. My project is titled No-verdose, using compartmental models and optimal control theory to model the opioid epidemic and reduce opioid-induced mortality. My mentors are Dia Bonsu, Alonso Aguada Oliva, and Dr. Seshire. So let's begin with some background on the opioid epidemic. The opioid crisis was declared a national public health emergency in 2017 and continues to significantly worsen the well-being of individuals and communities in recent years. According to the World Health Organization, drug use caused approximately 600,000 deaths in 2019, with 80% attributed to opioid misuse and 25% directly induced by opioid overdoses. These metrics are likely even higher in reality due to unreported and misreported cases. According to the United States Department of Commerce, opioid-induced overdose deaths continue to rise in recent years, with highly addictive opioids such as fentanyl accounting for the sharpest increase in mortality, with an over 700% increase from 2015 to 2021. One intervention for the opioid epidemic is digital education and prevention campaigns, which inform individuals of the dangers of addiction and promote dialogue in communities. Specifically, education campaigns have been shown to effectively increase opioid misuse awareness and decrease stigma. For example, the Truth About Opioids, an education campaign by Truth Initiative, drove a 46% increase in participants who acknowledged the speed that opioid dependency could occur, and a 20% increase in participants who intended to open up to trusted individuals about their opioid use. Compared to localized efforts, digital education campaigns are more likely to reach young people and underserved communities, groups that are disproportionately impacted by the opioid epidemic. Furthermore, education campaigns incentivize anti-addiction choices, catalyzing lasting behavior change. My research seeks to further the third United Nations Sustainable Development Goal, which focuses on global health and well-being. We employed an extension of the standard SIR model to model the opioid epidemic. So what is the SIR model? The SIR model simulates population dynamics by using differential equations to represent movement of people between different compartments, which are categories that describe an individual's current status. From compartmental models, solutions that maximize intervention outcomes while minimizing costs can then be found using optimal controls. First proposed by Kermack and McKendrick in 1927 and applied to drug epidemic modeling by White and Comiskey in their 2007 study of the heroin epidemic, SIR models effectively model opioid dynamics by capturing key transitions between states, including treatment, recovery, and relapse. Furthermore, SIR models efficiently simulate interventions through adjustable parameters. So this is the standard SIR model. The S, I, and R compartments represent susceptible, infected, and recovered populations respectively, and arrows represent the rate of movement between compartments and into and out of the system. In this example, mu represents the natural mortality rate and recruitment rate, which are assumed to be equal. Beta represents the infection rate, and gamma represents the recovery rate. Our proposed model is an extension of the SIR model called the SEIRP model. The SEIRP model contains 5 compartments: S, susceptible, E, exposed, I, infected, R, recovered, and P, prevented. Using the specified transmission rates between compartments, as well as the recruitment rate lambda, opioid-induced mortality rate mu, and natural mortality rate nu, we describe the opioid dynamic system with the 5 differential equations shown on the right, known as state equations. The SEIRP model is unique because it accounts for individuals who avoid opioid misuse for a lifetime due to digital education and prevention campaigns. Therefore, individuals in the recovered compartment return to the susceptible compartment with relapse rate rho, while individuals in the prevented compartment do not relapse. Tables 1 and 2 on the right describe the meanings of the model parameters and model compartments, respectively. The SEIRP curves on the left depict the proportion of individuals in each compartment from time t equals 0 to t equals 10 years. We demonstrated that the SEIRP model is biologically plausible with two mathematical proofs. First, we used the Picard-Lindelof theorem to show that a continuous unique solution exists, and then prove that this solution remains non-negative throughout a valid time interval. Next, we proved that the unique solution remains bounded. Specifically, the sum of the compartment sizes resides between its lower bound 0 and its upper bound, the maximum of the initial sum and the ratio of the recruitment rate to the natural mortality rate. After establishing the model, we found the basic reproduction number R0 using two methods. R0 is the expected number of secondary infections produced by one infected individual in a fully susceptible population. Since our model contains one infected compartment, we first found R0 as the product of the exposure rate, progression proportion, and average duration of infection. We derived each of these three values from our model as shown. The disease-free equilibrium, or DFE, is the steady state of the system where the size of the exposed, infected, and recovered compartments are 0, and the size of the susceptible compartment is constant. We found S0, the number of susceptible individuals at the disease-free equilibrium, as shown. And finally, substituting the value of S0 into the product, we found the expression for R0, which evaluates to approximately 1.65 under the initial conditions of our model. An R0 value greater than 1 suggests that the epidemic will spread, as each infected individual infects on average more than one other individual. As shown in the bottom right figure, R0 increases rapidly with high exposure rates and low recovery rates. Then we verified R0 using the next generation matrix method. From the state equations, we constructed the vectors F script and V script, which are the vectors of new infections and other transitions respectively. Then we found the Jacobian matrices F and V and computed the dominant eigenvalue of the next generation matrix FV inverse, which confirms the previous R0 calculations. Okay, now let's transition to the optimal control problem. To derive the optimal intensity of the education intervention, we introduced the control variable U1. The quadratic cost function J is a weighted sum of the cost of opioid addiction, which is proportional to the population of people actively misusing opioids, and the cost of the education campaign. We derived the updated state equations and Hamiltonian. Then, using Pontryagin maximum principle, we derived the updated adjoint equations, then solved for the optimal control U1 star by setting the partial derivative of the Hamiltonian with respect to U1 equal to 0. We enforced an upper bound of 1, which represents exerting maximum intervention efforts, and a lower bound of 0, which represents exerting no intervention efforts at all. In order to solve for the value of U1 star over the 10-year interval, we used the forward-backward sweep algorithm. First, we initialize solutions for the control, state, and adjoint variables. Then, we solved for the state equations forward in time and the adjoint equations backward in time. After each iteration, we updated U1 star and checked for convergence within a small tolerance. When U1 star converged, the algorithm was complete. The red curve depicts the optimal quadratic control intensity over time. We found that the optimal control intensity remained at its maximum value for the first 7.4 years, and then decreased continuously from 7.4 to 10 years as the size of the infected compartment decreased. And the blue curve shows that the combined cost of active opioid misuse and education efforts decreased over each iteration of the forward-backward sweep algorithm. Additionally, the system stabilized after one iteration and converged within 7 iterations. The SEIRP curves with the quadratic control cost did not vary significantly from the SEIRP curves prior to adding the control, suggesting that the education campaign did not notably alter the course of the simulated epidemic. The bottom right graph here depicts the value of the cumulative cost function J over the 10-year interval, and the top right graph depicts the value of the marginal cost over time. And the marginal cost attained its maximum value at approximately 9.48 years. Next, we approached this optimal control problem by representing the cost of the education campaign as a linear term in the cost function J, which is still a weighted sum of opioid misuse prevalence and intervention costs. The state and adjoint equations remained the same as in the quadratic control approach. In the Hamiltonian, the term representing the intervention cost was replaced with the linear term, and all other terms remained the same. So in the linear control approach, when taking the partial derivative of h with respect to u1, u1 star did not appear in the switching function. So therefore, we took the derivative of the switching function with respect to time and substituted the appropriate derivative values using the state and adjoint equations. Now, since u1 star did not appear in the first derivative either, we took the second derivative and solved for the value of u1 star. And these are the results. The function f1 is equal to the coefficient of u1 star in the second derivative, and the function f2 is equal to all terms not containing u1 star in the second derivative. u1 star assumes the value of u1 singular when the switching function equals 0. Now, again, we implemented the forward-backward sweep algorithm with the linear cost function. So the red curve here depicts the optimal control intensity over the 10-year interval. We found that the optimal control intensity remained at its maximum value for the first 7.4 years, and then discontinuously jumped to its minimum value at 7.4 years and remained at its minimum as the number of infected individuals decreased beyond a certain threshold. Furthermore, the optimal control intensity does not assume any values between its maximum and minimum, meaning it is purely bang-bang, and does not contain a singular arc. As in the quadratic control approach, the blue curve shows that the total cost of active opioid misuse and education efforts decreased over each iteration. The system stabilized after one iteration and converged within 3 iterations. Again, the SEIRP curves with the linear control cost also did not vary significantly from the SEIRP curves prior to adding the control. The bottom right graph depicts the value of the cumulative cost function J over the 10 years, and the top right graph depicts the value of the marginal cost over time. So with the linear cost term, the marginal cost attained its maximum value at approximately 9.54 years. All right, next we evaluated the effectiveness of representing the education campaign with a quadratic and linear cost term by comparing the size of the infected compartment, the marginal cost, and the cumulative costs over time. With quadratic control cost, the intervention reduced the number of individuals actively misusing opioids for the first 9.87 years of the 10-year interval. With the linear control cost, the intervention reduced active opioid misusers for the first 9.84 years of the 10-year interval, and for both approaches, the maximum difference in the infected compartment size occurred at 5.8 years, when the number of active misusers was still rising. Furthermore, we observed that the optimal control intensity for both approaches remained at the maximum value between t equals 0 and 7.4 years, leading to identical curves in that interval. After the epidemic passed the peak number of infections, the immediate benefits of the education campaign subsided due to increasing costs to prevent less infections. However, this graph does not measure the long-term benefits of education, which reduces future susceptibility to opioid misuse through individual behavior change and shifting community norms. These curves represent the marginal cost differences over time. So due to the discontinuous jump from the maximum to minimum value in the linear control intensity, the marginal cost of implementing the linear control cost discontinuously decreased, causing the orange none minus linear and green quadratic minus linear curves to discontinuously increase. However, this occurred after the bang-bang control dropped due to the lag between change in control intensity and consequent change in marginal cost. For over 96% of the 10-year interval, implementing the education campaign as a quadratic rather than linear cost term yielded lower total costs. Therefore, our model suggests that under most circumstances, a continuous control is more cost efficient than a bang-bang control to mitigate opioid-induced mortality. However, the practical effectiveness of both approaches also depends on public policy goals. Quadratic and linear cost functions have different implications for real-world deployment. Quadratic cost functions represent situations where increasing intervention efforts lead to diminishing marginal returns. The quadratic term encourages moderate interventions such as long-term opioid avoidance in small communities. In contrast, linear cost functions represent situations where returns scale directly with intervention efforts. As a result, linear control intensity tends to jump between its maximum and minimum values, which is appropriate for aggressive interventions such as immediate widespread awareness when addictions spike in large cities. Scaling digital campaigns often leads to diminishing returns, as an increasing fraction of impressions reach audiences who have already seen the message. Repeated exposure may also accelerate viewer fatigue. So in this case, a quadratic cost function would be more appropriate. However, if efforts are directed toward expanding the campaign to various platforms such as different social media apps and news channels, or to a variety of online communities through micro-influencers, this wider message distribution could mitigate diminishing returns. In this case, a linear or hybrid cost function would be more appropriate. So to summarize our key findings, in the SEIRP model, the optimal control intensity for both quadratic and linear cost functions dropped from the maximum value at t equals 7.4 years. Implementing the digital education campaign reduced the combined costs of opioid addiction and campaign efforts for over 96% of the 10-year interval. And before accounting for specific policy goals, the continuous quadratic control cost was more effective than the bang-bang linear control cost. Furthermore, the quadratic and linear control costs yielded similar results, including dropping from their maximum values at the same time and producing similar effects on the infected compartment, as well as marginal and cumulative costs over the 10-year period. This consistency demonstrates that our model is robust toward both aggressive and moderate intervention plans. Therefore, our model informs two different intervention frameworks to aid policymakers faced with various levels of resources, urgency, and long-term goals in combating the opioid crisis. So what's next? In the future, we plan to integrate a second control U2 into our opioid dynamics model. U2 represents the quality and accessibility of addiction rehab programs, which influence the recovery rate from the infected to the recovered compartment. And after solving for the optimal values of U1 and U2 with both quadratic and linear cost terms, we plan to utilize our findings to improve real-world resource allocation and minimize opioid-induced mortality rates. I'd like to acknowledge George Mason University's College of Science for supporting the ACIP program, which made this project possible. Additionally, I'd like to acknowledge my mentors, Thea Bonsu, Alonzo Guadaoliva, and Dr. Seshire for their support and guidance. Finally, I'd like to acknowledge the organizers of Symbiote EXPO for this valuable opportunity to share our work with students, teachers, and researchers across the globe. Thank you for attending my talk and learning about our research. Does the audience have any questions for me?